Hello and welcome to an Ausbiz virtual investor event, Succession. Now, we've had an enormous response to this, which just goes to show what an important issue it is. I'm David Koch. I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so as we're going to try and give you some ideas you can use, some information you can take away to really help you think about the process of transferring wealth from one generation to the next. So let's get into it. We've got a lot to get through, a lot of your questions to answer. And in the first session, I'm joined by Cody Harmon, co-founder and director of Cruz Family Office, Michael Bassina, partner with Piper Alderman, and Greg Daniels, strategic counsel for Premier National. Gents, welcome. The response we've had to this is enormous. You guys are at the forefront. First question is, we've themed it around succession, the show. How realistic is that, Cody, with some of the family offices you deal with and some of the families?
Yeah, it's a bit dramatised. However, a lot of commonalities in the show are you generally have a patriarch that in a lot of cases over-focuses on building wealth and continuing to chase more growth in their business, build more wealth as a family, and as a result of that, maybe neglect some time spent with family and actually building and nurturing those relationships.
Greg, is there always a power battle between the founder and the kids who want to undermine mum and dad and say, hey, I want my slice of the empire early?
Well, I think, Koshi, there is always a power battle. It may not be as dramatic as was portrayed in Succession. I hope anyway. So I think it's a natural thing. I think if you have a founder of a business that grows the wealth of that business through perseverance and hard work and dynamism, then inevitably the personal side will get a bit left behind.
Right.
So the kids are usually then often left to their own devices to make their own decisions without proper input from the family.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing and why this has become so important is because of this massive transference of wealth that's about to happen.
Michael, how big is that transference of generational wealth?
Well, Koshi, thanks for having us on. That's one of the biggest transfers of wealth I think the world will see as we see the demographics move, and a lot of successful business founders looking to pass on their legacy. And just to build on that comment, I think I've been practicing law for nearly 20 years, and most disputes in the courts have some kernel in a personal relationship or a personal issue that's come up. They're not always purely driven by just the law or an argument over the contracts.
Right, okay. So, because founders are a set personality, aren't they? They're a type A personality, they're very confident, power sits comfortably with them. Often they don't want to delegate it. Is that one of the nubs of the issue?
I think so, coupled with alignment of expectations. And when, sorry to lawyer it, but contracts and other documentations are about aligning expectations, but they don't always capture everything. And so I think to Cody's point, having that emotional alignment or real communication is super important.
And Greg, how many families have contracts between Not many, I would suggest.
Not many.
No.
Not many. And I think if the negotiation of those contracts would create massive schisms within themselves.
Yes.
So I think it's something that a lot of these families shy away from initially.
Yeah.
But with guidance from people like Cody, I think can come to the table.
Cody, succession is all about legacy. What's the meaning of legacy in this instance?
Well, David, it might be better reframed as another question: is what does your family name mean to you?
Right.
And what set of values and actions do you want to transpose and impart to the next generation, perpetuate in your family? And so when you think about legacy, it's not just about money. It's also about how do we educate our children so they're ready to not just inherit the wealth, but actually get it and take it and move it to another level. Mm-hmm. And so that involves involving them on investments as a family. That involves bringing them into some of the deals that you're invested in and giving them work experience and encouraging them to take risks. It's not enough to just go private school, Sandstone University, it's all done and you're okay. You have to be involved, spend time with kids and be a great role model.
So how do you articulate that? What age do you start at?
Well, we have some clients who are barely talking or they're on iPad and the best they can say is cake. But ultimately, there's no age that's too young to start. Right. I think through osmosis, the kids are going to pick it up, and it's an exciting thing. We've had 9 and 11-year-olds say, we just want to be a loving family. We want to spend time with grandma and grandpa. Okay. You know, something like that is put in what we call a family charter, and that's a document that actually gives us a bit of governance, and we hand that charter that articulates the legacy of the family and give that to all other advisors that are advising them, like say Michael, who he actually does a lot of the commercial work and legal work for some of our clients.
But to be clear, the family charter is not a lawyered up document where people are debating who unloads the dishwasher.
Whoa. Take me back to this family charter. What does it set out? What does it do?
It first, at a high level, has the legacy of the family and a family crest. And then from there, it has a list of values and actions that the family wants other people to know or their advisors to know. And it also articulates...
Give me an example.
Well, we want to encourage our children to be risk-taking and entrepreneurial.
Right.
And the kids might have input and say, always kick a soccer ball with Dad. Right. Dad always has to kick a soccer ball with me. They're types of things that we put into this document. And then there's other things that are more financial related around, you know, always look for investments that will build wealth, always provide housing for anyone in our extended family, regardless of their situation, whether they're addicted to drugs and things. These are important considerations.
Royal family could do a bit of that.
Well, having those discussions up front and having someone facilitate that is really important, because it's very hard to have that around the dinner table without someone else there facilitating and taking a bit of the heat.
Yeah, Michael, so you see these charters from a lawyer's point of view. So how does it set up the dynamics of the family going forward in terms of cooperating with each other? I reckon it's a sensational idea to set the ground rules right from the very start, and must make your job easier when you start to get down to the legal fine points going, well, is this legal issue in line with the charter that the entire family has agreed to?
Well, absolutely. Koshi, it's, I suppose that old saying, people don't plan to fail, they fail to plan. And that kind of charter document, it's not a super detailed document unless people want it to be, but certainly would encourage them not to have it super detailed. It's a roadmap to have alignment so that when those issues come up, because when you really get into the weeds and putting in structures in place and more detailed contracts and things like that, that those points of difference can come out and people have different incentives. I think, you know, really that guiding legacy, once it's set down and everyone has agreed to it, lets you then narrow in on the details in a structured way, and it helps avoid perhaps the kind of things that we've seen on the Succession show where someone will be playing silly games in the background, because you can get that initial alignment.
Right. So first step, set the charter. Second step, that leads to the structure.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. What sort of structures should you be considering?
Oh, how much time do we have? Look, because you have two main kinds. As Cody said, you have sort of generational shifting where you have kids coming up, and you have other family offices and businesses where it's already set. So there's always an initial structure, and every business is a bit different, and every family has a different setup of what they have. So it's about reviewing all of that and saying, right, where is the tax optimal outcomes going to be? Where is the dispute prevention and protection aspects going to lie? Redesigning where that needs to be in the future. So it's really a big planning exercise to get there, and then the details can be deployed from there.
Okay, so what are the different structures you should be looking at? What are the key ones?
Well, obviously family trusts are a very popular and well-known structure.
And they still work?
That's
because
right.
They've been fiddled with a lot, haven't they, over the years?
Well, that's right. But I mean, the biggest shift we're seeing at the moment, of course, is a change from people being able to paper the returns at the end of the year, sort of at March for the previous financial year, through to a position where the cash needs to move and dividends need to be properly declared at 30 June. So it's brought forward some of that planning, which in the long run is not a bad thing for many family offices and even just businesses and people to do, is to make sure that they're sorted out by 30 June and the things are in place, versus doing it 9 months later and then trying to engineer a better tax outcome. The government has certainly said we want to see the reality of the dollars flowing in the way that the accounts are set up and reduce complexity there, albeit it causes challenges when there's a shift around that. But having that planning in place and knowing that's what it's going to be going forward, and also, you know, income splitting has come under scrutiny, and there's other structures that can do other things. There's a lot of different complexity.
What other structures?
Well, look, there's testamentary trusts are still a probably underused vehicle in Australia because they come out of a will. So somebody has to die for a testamentary trust to come into existence.
That's a bit harsh.
That's right.
Anyhow.
But for succession planning, that's really important because at the time where someone is going into care, it's often too late to be altering the will, or it creates the very concerns that Cody was speaking about earlier of distrust and what's happening. Someone's changing the will. But testamentary trusts are very powerful in terms of how long they can last. There are other interesting products that are out there that can fit into a longer term plan, but it's more about setting that plan and then working out what's going to best fit in there to meet the goals of the family in that building the legacy and having everyone pull together from that perspective.
Okay.
And then it's the tax efficiency around that to say, what is it you're trying to achieve, and let's do it in an efficient way.
Okay. All right. Now, as I said at the start, we have had so many of your questions come through. It's been incredible. They largely fall into three buckets: the different structures for managing and eventually passing on wealth, how to protect those assets from being overtaxed, and how to protect those assets from being either squandered by those inheriting them or moved outside of the family in the case of divorce. That is a very tricky one. So let's start with structures. Don't go anywhere because we are going to go straight into the structures now. And Michael, you've touched on a few of them already here. Family offices, family trust, testamentary trust, SMS, or just straight up a will. What are the pros and cons of each, and who are they best suited for? So let's start family offices and family trusts.
Well, family office being a discrete setup for a family that has a business that they want to manage inside, usually either with virtual assistants or sometimes having someone in an office. So of a certain size, then it makes sense to have someone looking after that. And so the larger...
What's a general rule of thumb for...
I'll throw to Cody on that one.
Yeah.
Thanks, Trav.
Well,
look, what's really interesting is that we're finding more and more people are actually paying a higher flat entry point as a fee for service to get them set up. And they're not necessarily based on a certain number of funds under management or an actual net worth metric to set up a family office. It can be done quite cheaply under a multi-family office structure. It's a collection of your family members, your entities, the legacy of the family, and then bringing that into a quarterly meeting cadence. So for the first time, the actual family members are not chasing their accountant, chasing their lawyer, their advisor and accountant are fighting. It actually brings them into a management team structure and creates board-level collaborative advice.
Right.
So it actually makes people accountable to a higher purpose legacy, not what's better for my process or what's better for the tax or protection from the lawyer's point of view.
So to come back to your original question, you might see a lot of people have a family trust set up, perhaps with what's called a bucket company sitting underneath that. As a basic level, some have trading trusts operating a business. As things become more successful and get bigger, you might then have this multi-family office service to help bring things together and better coordinate tax, accounting, lawyers, and other financial aspects and legal aspects. And then if it becomes bigger from there, you may end up with some full-time employees who are just running the portfolio of investments.
Right.
So, and that's often the goal of family offices, is to build up sufficient wealth to have somebody looking after it near full-time to have that worry taken away and make sure filings and other legal compliance.
So when you talk about multi-family office here, these are family offices that look after multi-families, don't they? So that it's another advisor who pulls everything together.
Correct. Yeah, and then you move up, as Michael said, to a structured family office where you actually
which is dedicated staff.
Yeah, the actual private investments, the net worth of the family, they've usually exited from a business interest or two, become so substantial, it warrants an entity set up and even employees itself, including usually an internal accountant's the first port of call. That may be hired an internal wealth management sort of investment specialist as well.
Greg, how have you observed examples of families that have done it the right way?
Well, Koshi, I've been very lucky to be in a position where I've dealt with a number of extremely wealthy families in Australia and with global businesses as well, because I was chairman of the largest ad agency in the country for a long time, and a lot of those people were my clients.
Yep.
So over the years, you develop quite close relationships with them, and I've had a number of those family members put into my organisation, particularly those families that have had big connections with the media, and I won't name those people, but you know them, and to do mentoring and also apprenticeships, basically, within the firm to find out how the advertising industry actually works and how it relates to their own family organisation. So I think generally, and I've got to agree, the more I've talked to Cody and here Michael, the personal side of succession, the personalities and the relationships between the family are often the thing that creates the most havoc, not the money. The money is sort of the end game and the thing that people focus on outside the family, but inside the family there may be many reasons why you're having these aggressive discussions. So my experience of a lot of the wealthy families in Australia is a very positive one. I think what's happening now, though, is we're seeing this mass shift of baby boomer assets and businesses to generate a generation that probably hasn't worked as hard, if I could be a typical boomer.
Greg, that is very controversial.
I think we've had a tendency to spoil and give things rather than set out a strategy to make people appreciate the value and earn things. So that's where I think a lot of these questions are coming from now.
Yeah, because part of my family business, we own a platform called Startup Daily, which is for startup, scale-up entrepreneurs, founders, and venture capital. I got to say, so your comment, I think, relates to the next generation after a founder, because there are a lot of young founders today working just as hard as the boomer founders did to start their business. And I think that's really important to understand.
Yeah, and I think to a large extent that's Cody's market.
Yes.
I mean, there are older families, obviously, and they have, but a lot of those are legacy businesses. Part of my role in this is also on the technology side and on what's going to happen to business in the future. So you may have a business that you're inheriting, and it may be a legacy style business or an older style business. How do you take that business forward into this new digital age?
Yep, Greg, I agree with you with those comments on a lot of people, I say in my generation, they haven't gone through, if they haven't run a business, some of the struggle. Yeah. And it's more not generational, it's more, have you had to scratch and claw and get 100 punches in the face to build a business or take a risk and build wealth? Yeah. Usually the first generation has done that. The trick is making sure that the second generation is able to go through that struggle, but maybe you manufacture that in a way that's beneficial to them. It's not, well, you can give them a certain amount of capital. I mean, we had an example last year with a client, young kids. He was looking at investments to invest in. We found a business that was a Web 2, Web 3 hybrid. And it actually, for everyone listening, Web 3 obviously involves blockchain and crypto. And so that was able to register as an early stage innovation company. And that means that the amounts invested in that company were able to get a 20% non-refundable tax offset in the year of investment. And it's free of capital gains tax if the exit's within 10 years. So that investment also mandated that client's children were able to come in and get work experience and learn from an innovative business model that's going to be more prevalent in the next 5 to 10 years. That's probably one way of doing it. Another is also making sure that you give your children inputs, not outputs. Don't rob them of the satisfaction that they have when they buy their first home by giving them a home. Make them earn it, but also help give them an input and good education. Maybe let them take risks and have a few startups. If they have a good idea, let them fail, even though you know it might not be perfect. Don't try and overcoach them. Let them internally and intrinsically find out themselves what failure feels like. So then they have the resilience. By the time that wealth is transferred, they're getting that money and then equipped to deal with it.
Yep. Michael, can I come just because there's one area of structures that we've missed out. We've covered family trust, family offices, testamentary trust, particularly attached to wills, SMSFs. at the moment, the role they play in building family wealth?
Well, that's a huge part of the wealth transfer, and the way that the tax laws have been set and continue to be tweaked on the regular basis have also made them a very complicated area. So obviously any Australian is putting money in automatically, but most family office arrangements are able to take greater advantage of various concessional thresholds. It is a mechanism with the benefits and beneficiaries that can be named for transfer on death to move assets across at end of life. So SMSFs are a key part of anyone's planning, but they are so complicated with the rules changing all the time that they must be handled with extreme care. Because if you breach the rules, then horrible excess penalty tax can apply, and that's something that everyone wants to avoid.
So are they still worth it in terms of building a family wealth? Because a lot of private business owners used SMSF as a way of building their wealth, protecting their business or their personal assets from the business risk. Does that still apply?
It does, but I think that some of the benefit historically has been pulled back with the recent caps that we've seen in there. But you can't beat that 15% reduced tax rate flat on any earnings in the SMSF. So it's definitely beneficial. It's just there's a limit to that benefit now.
Right. So the pendulum has moved, if you like, back towards a family trust.
Well, I think, yes, as well as an SMSF. I think
Insurance bonds are back in vogue.
That's what I was about to turn to.
Oh, the insurance bonds.
bonds.
Blimey, I can remember when they were the boom, then they fell right out of favour.
Yep.
How are they back in vogue?
Well, with 100A, making sure that you can't have reimbursements arrangements from family trusts, and the ability to split income amongst family members is now more difficult. An insurance bond's really good when you have money that's already had tax paid on it, and it's sitting in a bank account, it's in maybe your personal name, and say your transfer balance caps in your super funds are at their maximum. We could actually use an insurance bond to cap your tax rate at 30%. So what we see a lot of families doing is actually lending or gifting money to a family trust, putting it on capital account, putting it into an actual insurance bond, and then from there, after about 10 years, so it's regulated by the Life Insurance Act, but if you contribute 125% a year for 10 years, between years 10 and 20, there's no tax being accrued above that 30% rate. So in year 20, you could have the growth from year 10 to 20 sitting there with the bond, and you could actually pull that out of the trust without the top-up tax you would see with a bucket company. So for money that has a long-term time horizon for investment, insurance bonds may be something to look at. Super is now obviously capped, so a lot of these wealthy families can't just throw infinite amounts in over time. And
insurance bonds have some other interesting legal quirks, particularly following death, that they can have prescribed ways that they can be spending the dividends that are coming in and returns for quite an extensive period of time. And have some interesting legal protections around things like bankruptcy and also that control aspect. So, which is quite important because, as you mentioned before, divorces and multi-families and blended families are quite common. And the family court can do a whole lot of variety of things and cut through a lot of different legal agreements depending on what the family court thinks is fair in a dispute situation. But insurance bonds have some very interesting mechanisms that can assist in that estate
They can't be touched.
They have some benefits over wills in terms of how payments can be directed and to whom. So they're quite powerful in that regard.
Wow, old-fashioned insurance bonds.
And
I didn't realise
tax. No death benefits
No
tax.
death benefits tax.
Yeah, on the amounts held for a certain period of time, whereas super now, if it's going to a non-CIS Act dependent, then you've got to cop it. So.
The complications, the wrinkles from passing a business on in a family, what sort of things does that throw up when a family business is part of the asset base and probably arguably the bank of the family business.
The heart of what built that wealth. And it's a tough one because sometimes there are children who don't want involvement in that family business, and yet there's those who do. So sometimes there's what's fair, there's what's equal, and there's things that you need to work through. But what we find is the main thing we need to make sure we avoid is that we don't give our children, that next generation, an unearned entitlement where they just slot in, take over the business, and they're not equipped to do so. So encouraging them to pave their own way, pave their own legacy as they're building their wealth. they could then come in maybe a bit later, mid to late 20s, in their 30s, and come into that business operation and assume a leadership position, and they're qualified and have the experiences and punches in the face to actually handle it.
So is that part of your original charter? Is what happens to
Sometimes
the business?
we give the clients those ideas to maybe consider that. Sometimes they still will look after their children by giving them a role in the business without going through that struggle, and that's okay. It's just that you need to plan around those preferences. So different cultures have different preferences for business as well. You obviously hear in a lot of Italian families, it's about a family business and passing it to the eldest son. So then if the daughter doesn't want a role to play, and I've seen these situations, you need to have the estate plan able to carve out some of those intricacies. So you might have a testamentary trust that is separate for the daughter, and that's controlled by certain members of the family, and then a separate trust for, say, one of the sons.
Right.
And so you have multiple variances. You can have people who genuinely could challenge an estate, and they're a black sheep of the family. And so you might want to make sure that you maybe have a life insurance policy on the actual person that, if they did decease, would result in the person that's ostracised coming in and challenging. That policy could pay out, and then the named beneficiary is the person that we don't want to challenge the original estate.
No.
So you can have some complex setups.
So you have a black sheep sort of insurance policy.
Yep.
To keep Greg happy, or from
well, unfortunately, insurance is too expensive once we get to Greg's vintage. But
But just a family charter can help there, because one of the key things with family provision claims and disputes around wills is where there's just nothing. You have a will and that's it, and someone can come in and say,
right,
but I was told I'd be looked after. And then you're into evidentiary issues, but something that the family has agreed to and has been in place for a long time is going to be given some weight.
Right.
And a lot of the bar and lawyers spend a lot of time on family provision claims. They are expensive, they run a long time. The fees are usually paid from the estate, so there is an incentive for people to have an argument about it, because they may not necessarily be funding it out of their pocket as it goes along. So there's more opportunity for matters of principle, which are very expensive, to be litigated, rather than a big incentive for deals to be done. So it's a lot of prevention around that to ensure that you're minimising the risk of problems going into a very expensive place.
Okay. All right. Plenty more to get through. Don't go anywhere. We're going to extend this discussion as well into family governance structures and philanthropy with our next session in just a moment. A reminder, nothing we've discussed is personal financial advice here. It is general information. It's basically to trigger a thought process for you to start thinking about, and then seek your own professional advice if you need to. Stay with us. We will be back in just a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Succession. I want to talk about philanthropy now, and also some of the broader dynamics which sit around wealth transfer. Now, I'm sure many of you would be familiar with this scene.
It doesn't even make any sense! I'm the eldest boy! I am the eldest boy! You're not! And it mattered to him. He wanted this to go on.
But gee, I bet a lot of people can relate to that scene there. And hopefully there's not the same sort of drama on that show with a complete lack of direction from the top. The next generation didn't know where they stood, of course, and that's a problem no matter how well you all get along privately. Joining me now are John Kenfield from the Solutionist Group and Louise Walsh from Walsh Capital. How are you? Both good to see you. John, let's start with you in terms of this whole area of governance structure and all the dramas that play out with family dynamics and the like. How do you ensure that the wealth transfer keeps the family happy?
Good morning, all. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, certainly can.
Great. I'd start with the family. The problem often is starting with the wealth, and as Greg was saying earlier on, that's often really not the key issue. The key issue is usually family dynamics, and so I would start with the family. I would be looking at getting a family started very, very early, as was mentioned previously. And I'd look at parenting styles, I'd look at communication, interaction, personalities, capabilities. And if you build a healthy family, conversations about the wealth transfer and the actual performance of it becomes a relatively simple thing to manage. It's relatively mechanical. If the family dynamics are seriously off, then you're at risk no matter what legal agreements you put in place.
Right. So Cody mentioned setting up a family charter, if you like, where you get the family together and you say, basically, what are the behaviours that represent our family? What's the legacy we want to leave? What's our commitment to the family, both from a personal level and a business level and an asset building level? Is that the starting point?
No, it isn't. It's often regarded as a starting point. A lot of families get referred to me, have been told they need a family charter or family constitution to solve their problems. And that's really putting the cart in front of the horse. You've got to, like any, it's not a legally binding document, as Michael says, but like any contract, you've got to work out your terms, your objectives, and your performance before you try to codify anything. Otherwise, the codification isn't owned by the family members. Right. So the starting point, to my mind, is you begin as early as possible with having family meetings. If you apply the concept of governance, which is basically means systems of management, it's not systems of control as such, it's more actively systems of management. If you start with family meetings, we like to organise at least an annual event where the family, multiple generations are working together, they know each other, they begin to learn how to interact with each other, and eventually you get to the point where it's appropriate to codify a series of policies and concepts and values that the family has developed through these meetings. And that's what becomes a family charter or a family constitution.
Okay.
But it's, in my mind, like item 7 on the list, it's certainly not something I think you should start with.
So who should be in the family meeting? Is it just, is it the founder and the kids, or is it partners, families? What you're saying is it all starts with good parenting, which is easier said than done, and then family dynamics change when kids get older and have a partner. It becomes really complex. So, how do you start the family meetings?
The first thing you've got to do is recognise that one size doesn't fit all, and you've got to work out. Is this a traditional conservative family? Is it a progressive modern family? Which has got nothing to do with age. It's all to do with attitude. Some families are keep things very close, and they're only comfortable keeping things to bloodline participation, and they will have very rigid rules about you can't participate until you're 21, 25, 30, or whatever. And you'll often even get control, checkbook type control, where there's almost a ruling from the grave in terms of what can be done. Other families will say, as soon as our children are capable of behaving in a responsible way in an adult meeting, we would like to introduce them to our meetings and our meeting processes. And obviously the parents are responsible for helping to manage those kids and making sure they've got information in a form that they find usable. But one of the most valuable things I found boards of directors feedback to me is saying, we get all our financial reports designed for 12-year-olds, and now for the first time, we all understand them. And so we've often had families with kids who are basically pre-teenage, but are quite responsible and willing to learn. And then we get feedback from their school teachers that they seem to know an awful lot more than their fellows because the family business education is supplementing their conventional education.
Isn't that interesting? You do a lot of conflict resolution with families. What are the key mistakes that you find that families make?
I'll repeat the earlier question, how much time do we have? The biggest problems are often blamed on poor communication, breakdown in communication, which is just wrong. The real issue is poor communication is a symptom of some underlying break or skew or toxicity in the relationships. And the relationships have often been impacted by strange behaviors, adverse life experiences, a whole raft of different things, which the family has not responded to as a group. So we often end up with things like what I call the broken wing syndrome, where you'll end up with mum protecting a damaged family member at the expense of the rest of the family, and often at the expense of a relationship with dad. Each individual situation has to be analysed. I'm just in the process of finishing a book called 50 Common Causes of Family Business Conflict. And since I started, I've got about another 20 common causes. So I can't really answer your question because there are so many. But they often appear in almost every type of conflict. There's a different variation of the same issues come up all the time, which means they're predictable and we do have some idea of how to manage them.
Yep. All right, I want to talk philanthropy now, and we've got a real trend overseas at the moment with some of the mega families in the United States and Europe who will just leave the wealth of the family that they built up to charities or other organisations and let the kids fend for themselves. Louise, is that much of a trend here in Australia at the moment?
Look, not really yet, David. And we're always a bit behind the eight ball on those sorts of trends, I think, particularly when it comes to philanthropy. If you think about sort of North America, it tends to always lead the way. So I don't think we've actually seen too much of that here. You do hear and see some families in Australia that are very committed to not leaving their kids too much. I mean, they will say, I'll buy them a house, I'll make sure they have, some of those things to get them started, but I don't want to leave them too much, because what I'm worried about is the dysfunctionality that does come about with too much money being left to children and them not actually earning their own way in life and understanding how the other half lives. So I'm probably all for leaving some, but not too much.
Yep. And it is funny when you see the statistics of giving. Australians are the most giving in the world, but it's usually the general population and not the really wealthy, whereas overseas it's the reverse, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. I mean, there's lots of research and lots of stats on this, that what we're leading at in the world is giving to response to natural disasters.
Yeah, to our communities.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So we're very good at that. We're very good at volunteering. We have one of the highest volunteering rates in the world as well. But I think there's a statistic that 37% of Australians who earn more than $1 million a year do not claim any tax deductibility for any charitable donation.
Wow.
Now, that is quite staggering when you think about it, because you think the wealthier you are, the more likely you want to be to minimise your tax. So that statistic hasn't really moved in 20 years. So there's something fundamentally wrong there. But I think the other difference here, as opposed to overseas, particularly in North America, is we rely on a lot of government funding for things, as does the UK and Europe. And that's where, like, an art gallery will not be built in North America unless the community gets behind that and donates to it, and then donates to put the paintings on the wall. Yeah. Whereas here, there is always some government funding that will underlie it, and then you're relying on some philanthropy on top of that. Okay. But it's just not part of our DNA. If you own a business in North America, it doesn't matter whether you're a motor mechanic or, a fund manager or whatever, you will be charitable. You will sit on a non-profit board. You will donate regularly, and we don't have that same culture here. It's because someone's twisted your arm that you'll end up sitting on a non-profit board typically.
Yep, exactly. What's the difference between philanthropy and charity? Is that sort of basically related to the size of the dollar value involved? Yeah,
I think it is to a degree. I mean, I think when I think of charity, I think of probably small donations that people make in response to it. Could be the salvos or, some sort of regular appeal that might happen at the end of financial year. You might kick in $20, $50, or someone's doing a fun run. You don't really think about it that much. Yep. Whereas probably philanthropy is more strategic. Yep. It is when you actually think strategically about a gift that will make a difference, and hopefully you will be engaged with that non-profit so that you're not just handing over the check. It's not just a transaction, if that makes sense, would be how I'd describe it.
How important is it to put philanthropy in succession planning and building it into the family legacy?
Well, I think it's fundamental. I mean, I'm a bit biased because obviously I used to run Philanthropy Australia, but I now have a capital raising business, so I'm dealing with family offices, ultra high net worths all the time. But what I've learned and observed very closely with a number of ultra high net worth families over the years is often there can unfortunately be some dysfunctionality in these families, and it can be quite unfortunate.
Which family doesn't have some dysfunctionality? That's the issue, isn't it?
I know.
And money seems to magnify it, though.
I think that's exactly what the issue is. And I think what I've seen is that philanthropy, if it's done well in a family, and that's typically where a structure is set up, they've set up a foundation, they get the family involved, it almost becomes a second business or a third business to that family. And it becomes a glue that actually binds that family together. Right. They have something common that they can sit around the dining room table, the kitchen table, the boardroom table, and actually discuss, and every member of that family can get involved. It doesn't matter what age.
Yep.
And there can be varying degrees of engagement.
All right. Those structures, though, there's a private ancillary fund, there's a tax, you can set up a not-for-profit. What's the best way of doing it?
Well, probably the most common and probably the best way for most families would be a private ancillary fund. They call them PAFs.
Yeah.
It's the acronym. And there's probably now about 2,500 of those in Australia. Now, that sounds like a lot, but they were set up with David Gonski and John Howard back in 2001. There probably should be 25,000, really. Yeah. So it does. We can all pat ourselves on the back and say, isn't that fabulous?
So what's the minimum that needs to go in to make it work?
Look, there's no set minimum, but I would say probably about 5 million.
Right.
So when it's quite common for a family to do it or an individual to do it is when they've had a liquidity event.
Yes.
They've typically sold a business, they're cashed up, and there are some tax benefits as to why you might want to do it as well. Right. But it fundamentally, it's not for every family. I mean, I think for some families, if you are giving away a lot of money and donating a lot of money internationally into developing countries, that structure may not necessarily be the best one, but if you are giving away your money fundamentally to Australian charities and non-profits, it's probably a good structure.
Okay. All right. Worth thinking about. As I've said, we have had literally hundreds of questions sent into this event, so stay around. We've got the final session coming up in a minute or two, and we're going to get our guests to answer as many as possible as I put your questions to our expert panel on succession. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to Succession and our final session now, where we're going to try and answer as many of your questions as we can. A reminder, answering these questions is not specific personal financial advice. This is general information, thought starters, if you like, for you to go and get your own professional advice if you need. And we've got Louise staying with us, Cody, Michael, and Greg online as well. First question, Cody, number of questions regarding the timing of inheritance. Are there different tax treatments to transferring assets before or after death?
Yeah, so when having a robust estate plan, there's various structures you can use. Family trusts, self-managed super funds, all have different consequences. Obviously, super funds in general, as a broad structure, can have death benefits tax to beneficiaries who are not, say, you might have a husband and wife, they are actual Cis Act dependents, but their non-dependent adult children will actually incur death benefits tax. So there can be a high amount of tax for the children if, say, both people were to go at the same time. So that's where you might look at some of those alternative structures we talked about previously.
Right.
Testamentary trusts have special provisions in the Tax Act where adult beneficiaries can receive distributions and have expenses paid for out of the trust. So let's use a practical example. Let's say we had a testamentary trust set up. It can exist for 80 years. We've got millions of dollars in there. grandchildren have private school fees. Instead of earning, say, $60,000 pre-tax to pay for the fees, they can be paid for straight out of the trust. So we're actually able to save a substantial amount on tax over a long period of time. Also, better yet, a family trust could act as a family bank account as well and potentially lend money to allow those children to buy their homes and act like a family bank as opposed to a real Big Four bank.
Right.
So there's a few dynamics there. Trusts are all about control. Who's the appointer? Read the deed, look at the back of the trust deed, and then when you see who is in ultimate control, it will list who actually can appoint and remove the trustee of the family trust. So it's about control. Trusts are great to transfer control before the death event. So let's say you have a substantial amount of a certain property you want to pass to a certain child, you could pass control of that trust over prior to that event happening.
Right, okay. Another question we received, a related question. How do you put structures in place which will last for multiple generations? Is there a realistic way of doing that? Blimey, it's hard to do it just for the first. Michael, is there?
Look, when you're looking at multiple generations, companies and investment companies jump to the fore because a company can exist and it, unlike, say, a testamentary trust or another trust that has a certain time when it will expire, we still have in Australia many companies that were founded right at the start of when companies were invented, willed into existence by Parliament. So you're looking at more corporate structures around that kind of longevity to really have that multiple generation if you're really going for that legacy long term.
Right. Another question, Cody, how can I structure my superannuation so my adult children don't get the beneficiaries tax? You were saying if you distribute through your SMSF, they will get beneficiary, basically death duties. Is there any way of avoiding it?
I wouldn't use the word avoid because that might capture some...
better plan.
But yeah, we could, as an example, if someone's over those transfer balance cap limits, we could actually do a lump sum withdrawal from a pension environment and actually look at, or from super as well, and actually look at using some of those insurance bond structures and trusts if the time frame warrants such a longer term investment and utilising those bond structures. There are, I guess, ways around that are a lot of forward planning and making sure that through a lot of modelling, maybe 10, 20 years out, you know when you're going to hit those transfer balance cap limits, and you can actually look at setting up alternative structures ahead of time to ensure that we have the most optimal tax planning strategy.
Okay. All right. Greg, you work with a lot of families, as you were explaining before. This has been one of the most common questions we've received from viewers. How do I ensure my children don't lose any of our wealth to possible future partners? The complexity of a family is great. You trust your own children. When they bring in a black sheep partner, that throws everything into the air, doesn't it?
Yes, unfortunately, that is a fairly regular occurrence. Look, I am not the legal expert here. So I'll defer that, I think, to Michael. But it is something that does happen quite frequently, and in my experience with families that I've dealt with, it's extremely disruptive and also often enduring. So there's a great degree of emotion in families around this particular subject. But one could say use your common sense, but on the other hand, I think it gets down to the lawyers at the end of the day and how these things are structured.
All right, let's bring in the lawyer. Michael, is there any way of sort of outing the outlaws from getting their hands on any of the family wealth?
Well, Koch, I think when it comes to that point, it's a prevention is better than the cure. So it's only something that can be dealt with before it happens to put things in place. And I think going back to what Cody mentioned earlier around a family charter or family rule book on how are things going to be dealt with. It's very difficult if a adult child of a patriarch or matriarch come in and say, I've met the love of my life, and they're not quite as keen, or at that point to say, okay, but here's how it's going to work. If that's already been socialised with the family and agreement's been reached on how these things are going to be managed, then the expectations are better set. And then you're entering positions like knowing, structuring wise, trusts and, to Cody's point, insurance bonds and other mechanisms that might have named beneficiaries or someone who gets to decide what goes to whom, and also for anything which is in that adult child's name as an asset, that's something that's going to be more liable to be under challenge in the event of a divorce.
All right, so you're saying almost if partners come into the family, you set up an insurance bond for them, and that's part of the prenup, if you like, and say, hey, you're not part of the trust, but here's something just for you.
Maybe on that note, I think a lot of those challenges could be once the first generation, assuming that's in contact and it's a strong relationship, it's the second generation. So what we often see is testamentary trusts that have different appointers and co-controllers of those entities. So you might have a trust set up that is controlled by, say, a sibling that's trusted and yourself. So there's an extra layer of protection. Or you might have, say, Michael and me are brothers. I might control his trust and he might control mine. And it's important that it's not necessarily documented that way. Administratively, it can be quite difficult to run, but an extra tip on top of that is in the deed of the testamentary trust, specifically ensuring that binding financial agreements are entered into before capital distributions are allowed from that entity. And then they're updated, say, every 5 years. So you can rule from the grave, but the more complexity you put in, the more difficult it is for that generation to run with it.
Let's use the American terminology rather than the Australian. Prenups sort of essential when your kids find a partner, you go, right, yep, they've got to sign this prenup, which has been put together by the family and the advisors.
Yeah, there's a lot of taboo around the topic. A lot of people think that a prenup or a binding financial agreement is, don't go there, it permeates distrust. But
that's why we've had so many questions on this topic, because it is taboo.
Yep.
No one wants to talk about it except on a forum like this to say, give me some guidance.
Yeah. Well, at a certain, there's a certain level of wealth disparity when entering a relationship. Say you are the son of $1 billion family, or it's worth hundreds of millions, and then the new partner that you're marrying doesn't have any wealth. In a lot of instances there, binding financial agreements make sense.
Yep.
Now, you could do that in a way where that partner is, if they left, say, within 5 years, they're actually leaving with more money than you would deem to be fair in a conversation. Mm-hmm. So there are situations where it makes sense. It's a sensitive conversation to have, but it's an important one.
Yep.
And I'll just give one tip to our viewers on having those conversations. And I say this to clients all the time. You don't sit down to say, what are we going to do in cutting up our assets in the event we break up? The way to start that conversation is to say, how are we going to treat this situation if one of us dies? It's much easier to sit down and say, if I get hit by a bus, what are your expectations as to what should happen? And what happens in that scenario will align very closely with what would happen in a relationship breakdown. And it's the same in business. If you have a business partner who's part of that business, to say, well, what if you get hit by a bus, what's your expectation? And to your point about Startup Daily made earlier, where you have upcoming wealthy families that have outside investors and business partners more heavily involved than in perhaps the traditional immigrant to Australia who built up an empire with much more centralised ownership and less partners in there. So having that conversation is a lot easier around which is strange because death is also a taboo topic in our society, but it's a lot easier to discuss than a what if we break up or what if we have a massive fight argument.
Yeah, and using that question is the same as the next generation wanting to know what's in their parents' will.
That's exactly right.
It's the exact taboo subject, but one you got to cover. Cody, another question. How do I get a good succession plan without paying heaps of tax and huge bills from accountants and solicitors? And as I always say in this, you've got to keep it in perspective. You are protecting these bills are like your insurance policy to make sure you get it right, because you're going to lose so much if you don't get it right, is the other side of looking at it.
Yeah, it's such an important consideration. And often if a client I mean, Michael's a very ethical practitioner, but if a client goes directly to a lawyer or an accountant in isolation, often the way they're remunerated is through hourly rates. So there's an incentive to spend more time potentially than is needed on that file. So from our perception, without obviously being biased, family office is the only structure, governance structure globally that I've seen that actually brings everyone together and actually assists where possible to ensure that everyone is acting in the best interest of the collective family and its legacy. So
do you bring the accountants and solicitors, or can you bring your own if you decide to go to a multi-family office like yours?
We have flexibility with obviously engagement, but one of the main things is we'll work with someone if they're a trusted accountant in the family. It's disruptive to just dislodge relationships. However, if someone doesn't engage and they're used to being the trusted advisor, it's not about us, it's not about who's a trusted advisor, it's about the family, there's a management team. The family's legacy is this. Everyone come to that meeting and play ball. If they don't engage, then yes, there's vetted experts like Michael and others who we have that mobilise within seconds to come into those meetings and collaborate and work to create a great synergistic outcome for the family. So it's important to collaborate, engage, and have everyone work together.
Greg, are you there? Do you have a comment on that as well? John, sorry?
You're going to comment a little bit on the previous question about the divorce, and I think that having a family rule that says you must have a binding financial agreement that Cody was mentioning takes a lot of the emotion out of it and makes that all work. The second question about collaboration, I think that because families are so different and so multifaceted, that the idea of collaborative advisory is absolutely fundamental. And the challenge for people working in the space is finding a cadre of complementary professionals who are very much focused on the holistic family need rather than on how do I protect the individual client or even something worse than that. So collaboration is a whole big thing, and something like a family office is an excellent coordinator. They can be the umbrella, and in a lot of situations, acting somewhat like an advisory board, same sort of thing, they can make sure, because they have the expertise themselves, that the advisors who are working with the family are doing the right thing by the family. Appropriate costings, nobody's getting ripped off, not much stuff is falling through the gaps. So a coordinator, which is the family office or potentially an advisory board, but the family office is usually the best one because it's got control over the wealth, makes an awful lot of sense and helps families to, I think, function and prevent and avoid conflict very effectively.
We're getting lots of questions, Cody. You mentioned it a bit earlier on the investment bonds. I think, like me, a lot of people are a bit shocked thinking these sort of really conservative, fuddy-duddy investments from about 20 years ago are now making a resurgence in this area. A lot of people asking, can you just explain again why they're good for transferring wealth?
Yeah, so insurance bonds are governed under the Life Insurance Act. They are not an estate asset. So an estate asset are things like your home, possessions, investments and assets held in your individual names. So when you're, transferring those assets, they're subject to challenge if there is the chance of that happening. An insurance bond does have an ability to nominate beneficiaries and have certain customisation on how much capital is drawn down out of those vehicles over time. So they're great to ensure that things dodge the estate. In terms of tax as well, they also have an ability to have different ways of accounting internally. So the way that, and this is very detailed, it's an advice thing, but you can reconcile transactions in a different way internal to those structures. And if they invest in, say, geared investments and harvest franking credits in the right way, internally the tax rates of those vehicles can go from 30, in some cases, to sub 20%. So they're actually a very good alternative to superannuation now the caps are coming in. So to explain them again, very simply, insurance bond, it's more rigid, it's harder to access the money. If you access it within 10 years, there are tax penalties. However, if you can contribute 125% of the previous year's contribution. So you can say start with 100,000, and then 125,000 the next year, and so on. So there are certain rules. It's important to get advice with them because you can have unintended consequences. With that being said, they're a great tool that's now coming back in vogue due to 100A with trusts and less accommodating tax laws are now with superannuation.
Okay. All right. Another question here as well. How do you ensure your SMSF balance is bequeathed as per your instructions? So many people use the SMSF self-managed super funds to build their wealth now. They often hold family businesses in them. How do you make sure?
Yeah, so with a lot of self-managed super funds, one problem we find is individual trustees. So that means that family members themselves are actually the trustees of them. There are asset protection issues when having individuals control that super fund. And also, if, say, that individual trustee is sued in a personal capacity or they're a director of a business, it can have consequences. So ensuring there's a corporate trustee and the right people are in the director and shareholder positions of that vehicle can ensure a smoother transfer of assets in that self-managed super fund, and making sure that you have the right members in that fund as well, and not just running off with your own super fund, buying crypto and having too many members or anything like that. So a good accountant with a good SMSF admin practice, corporate trustee, because it's easier to transfer in the next generation because you can pass control of an entity, not go through and change the names of everything that's involved with that fund internally, because there is an individual trustee, and better for protection. So corporate trustee is the one I would work with there, and also maybe moving where you can money between member accounts in an efficient way to create potentially increase the tax-free components of certain member balances in that fund.
Okay. Michael, cross borders in terms of setting up structures for this. We've got a lot of people who have asked, for example, I'm from New Zealand, I invest in Australia and New Zealand. Does the structure need to change? We've had another person saying that he lives in Australia. Tax implications here because your children are in the UK who are beneficiaries, but your will resides overseas or here in Australia. How do you get through that?
Look, it gets very complicated very fast as soon as you go international. Right. It's one of the unfortunate issues with law and tax is we're jurisdiction specific.
Yep.
So that's a really hard one, and you need really good advice, usually with an accountant and lawyer on each side of the pond, as it were. Australia and New Zealand have some better coordination and collaboration on rules than other jurisdictions do, but it's a very difficult one. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that any better.
Okay. So is one country better than the other? For example, we've had Kiwis setting questions, Brits sending in questions about it.
Look, the way I always approach that is to say to someone, where do you want to live? It's not a question of trying to figure out questions around where should you be positioning assets. It's where do you want to live, because the tax officers will extend jurisdiction to where you physically are. I think unless you're planning on trying to live on a boat 5 months and 29 days and then in some little island for 6 months and 1 day of the year, it's very difficult to...
Well, you can live on a boat now, can't you, by these units?
Well, you can.
Some wealthy Australians, that's
right. And so for those guys, it might help there, but there's very expansive rules around when someone is a tax resident, certainly of Australia. So it's very difficult to not be a tax resident of Australia if you have assets here or you're doing any kind of business here. So for that sort of family office and generational wealth that's built up here, it's quite difficult. But with that said, as businesses expand internationally and have further international structuring, there are some opportunities that come out of that in terms of where dividends and things may go. But really the first question is, where do you want to live and where do you want your family to live? Because leaning into that jurisdiction to ensure you're 100% compliant there is the starting point, because you don't want to have troubles with the tax office. It's a very expensive argument to have.
No one wants that. And I think Michael underlines the point, whereas today's session is about getting you thinking, then you've got to go and get your own personal advice. And certainly that's the case if you're a family that is domiciled in a number of different countries. Louise, we've had a couple of follow-up questions from viewers asking, how do you set up a family not-for-profit or a fund that you were talking about? How difficult is it?
Well, a charity you certainly can set up. I mean, there is a lot of red tape though. I mean, so you need to be prepared to get charitable status. You've got to set up a board. I mean, there's a lot of admin. So, there are a number of young people now that think, right, I've got lived experience in something. I'm going to set up a charity, or I'm going to, build a school in Tanzania. It's all fantastic, but you do have to think about all that red tape that you do need to set up. Then, there's the governance structure. If you set up a charity, then you've got to fundraise. So, you've got to think about, is this going to be sustainable in 10, 15 years' time? So sometimes I would say, look, rather than setting up a charity yourself, think about who you might be able to partner with that is an existing charity in the first instance, and who's the who are the competitors, and could I add some value to them rather than setting up my own. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm all for increasing the entrepreneurial spirit, in this case social entrepreneurs, but setting up a philanthropic fund. So if you're a wealthy family or individual and you want to set up a foundation or a charitable trust, is not that difficult to do. You do need a good lawyer or accountant to help you, and there are definitely some around that are very good and specialise in this particular space. So it's not that difficult to do though. But you do probably need, as I said, something like 5 mil. You can do it with less, but you do need to give away at least 5% of the assets each year. You're required by law to do that. So you do need to have enough in the kitty to start with to make it worthwhile. And then, of course, you can add on to it. And
usually that comes with a liquidity event for your family business or whatever.
Yeah, that's the most
fascinating. Well, the time we've gone way over time because we've had so many questions, still so many more to ask. Thank you to Cody, to Louise, Michael, Greg and John as well. We'll have to do this again. I think it was so popular. Thank you for watching. If you missed anything and would like to catch up, we'll send you an email soon with all the details for a link to this that you can go back and watch again and take notes or get the family to watch. Might be a good idea as well. That can be the start of your early family meetings to tackle this subject and putting together your charter. So to the panel, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll catch you next time. Don't forget to tune in to Ausbiz if you want the latest business and investment news as well. Good to see you.